Hello everybody, Storm here, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a different kind of video, which, if you read the video description and title, you would know we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy games. In particular, the mainline numbered Final Fantasy games. So as you may or not be aware, I have been working on a project to play through all of the mainline numbered Final Fantasy games, and I just completed Final Fantasies 1 through 6 using the Pixel Remaster releases on PC. And so with the conclusion of Final Fantasy 6, that finishes all of the Final Fantasy games that I had never previously played before. And so that does mean that I have now played a version of every single mainline numbered Final Fantasy game at some point in my life. So with my project, we're now moving away from the games that I'd never played before and therefore were experiencing for the first time, and we're now moving into games that I have played before and will be re-experiencing in current year whenever I happen to get to them. And so it's going to be less about, figuring out what the game is all about for the first time, and more about, do these games hold up? Based on my memories of them and my current thoughts and opinions of them. And do my thoughts and opinions change after playing through these games again? So, to that end, what I wanted to do was create a ranking list using the ubiquitous tier list maker that you can find online, but I've turned it into a rank list to kind of go over my thoughts and opinions of each of these games and rank them against each other. And then once I do finish playing through all of the games that I have played before, I can then come back to this list and see if anything needs a readjustment, if any opinions of some of these games have changed after experiencing them again, because some of these games I haven't played in over 20 years. So, yeah, it should be interesting. I hope, anyway. So, we're going to work through all of the mainline numbered Final Fantasy games. We're not dealing with any of the spin-offs, sequels, or non-numbered games like Final Fantasy Tactics, for example. We're just sticking to 1 through 16 for now. And so, let's go ahead and get into that. But actually, before we get into it, I did want to discuss two things. One, as I talk about my opinions about these games, I'm going to try and keep things as spoiler-free as possible. But necessarily, in some instances, I'm going to have to talk about certain aspects of the game, which may or may not entail some spoilers. So just be aware that that may happen. Okay. And second, this is going to be a ranking list of all of the Final Fantasy games, and as necessary, I'm going to have to put some of these games near the bottom of the list. And just because I rank a game low on the list does not necessarily mean that I disliked the game or that I think the game is bad, right? It's just, I gotta put them somewhere, and if they don't hold up against the rest of the field, they kind of have to go toward the bottom. So, and as also is going to be a little bit necessary, I'm going to have to discuss why I'm putting some of these games at the bottom of the list, and so some of my opinions might turn a little negative. But again, for the most part, I've enjoyed all these games, and I think they're all good. Hopefully that makes sense. Alright, so let's start all the way at the bottom with number 16, Dead Last. And the game that's going to be at number 16 is going to be the one game that is a caveat to everything I just said. Because while I have played this game, I've never actually finished it. I got so thoroughly bored by the game halfway through that I just stopped playing and never found my way back. And it's also the one Final Fantasy game that I actually dislike and don't particularly consider to be an enjoyable game. So, yeah. And that game, coming in at number 16, is going to be Final Fantasy 15. I did not care for Final Fantasy 15. I just couldn't get into the story. The characters I just didn't find interesting. Yeah, it just did not click with me. I bounced off of it. And I gave Final Fantasy 15 every chance that I could to succeed, because this was also a time where Square Enix, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that Final Fantasy needed to be a multimedia franchise, not just a video game. And so they released a, I can't remember how many part anime mini-series. They went into the backstory of all the main characters, which I did watch. They released a, full-length featured CGI animated film. There was an immediate prequel to the actual game, which I also did watch and actually rather enjoyed the movie. And that got me pretty excited for the game. And that didn't last very long once I actually started playing. So yeah. Just didn't work for me. Now, on a positive note, the one thing that I actually did enjoy about Final Fantasy 15 was the combat. Now, I know that the action combat Final Fantasies 15 and 16 are a bit of mixed in the community. There's some that like them and a lot that don't. I don't care, personally. I don't care whether the combat is turn-based, ATB-based, action-based. As long as it's a well-designed system and it's fun to play, I don't care what the actual structure of the combat system of the game is. And that said, I did like the combat in Final Fantasy 15, but that's pretty much the most I could say. Now, it's possible that the game gets good in the half I didn't play. Though I have talked to some people that have finished the game, and while they didn't spoil anything for me, they did give me the impression that it doesn't get much better, but we'll see. Also, when I originally played Final Fantasy 15, I played on the PS4 at launch. So that means that I didn't have access to any of the DLCs that were eventually released for the game, which, in my replay of the game, we're going to be playing on PC with all the DLCs. So maybe, just maybe, there's something in the DLC that makes everything better, but I'm not holding my breath. So, yeah. It's going to be the last Final Fantasy game that I play as part of this whole series, so we'll see how that goes. Alright, so let's just leave Final Fantasy 15 alone for now, and let's move on to the next games in the list, which I'm going to be considering the next 3 spots, 15, 14, and 13, as a set. Because the games that I'm going to be putting at these 3 spots are going to be the 8-bit era Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3. And the reason why I'm putting these games this far down the list is based purely on technological limitations. Just the fact that because they were on the 8-bit Nintendo or Famicom systems, they were just necessarily very limited in what they could do. And when you just stack them up against even the 16-bit era games, they just kind of pale in comparison. And so I can't really rank these games any higher than this, even though I did enjoy playing all 3 of them. Right? As I said, I'm not considering these are bad games. I enjoyed playing them. I think they were pretty good. But you can't stack them up against anything else right now. So, coming in at number 15, I'm going to be putting Final Fantasy 1. Final Fantasy 1 was a solidly executed game. If I had played that when I was a kid back in the 80s, I probably would have enjoyed the hell out of it. But, with, all of the other games available to me, it's kind of thin. Little to no characters, little to no story, but otherwise solidly executed is what I would call Final Fantasy 1. So for the next 2 spots for Final Fantasies 2 and 3, I did debate a bit with myself about which spot each of these games are going to be in. So who's going to be ahead of who. And what I ultimately decided on is that coming in at number 14 is going to be Final Fantasy 3, and coming in at 13 is going to be Final Fantasy 2. Yes, I'm putting Final Fantasy 2 ahead of Final Fantasy 3 for me. Now, why is that? Well, Final Fantasy 2 gets a lot of criticism for its character progression system, because it eschews a kind of standard EXP-based leveling system for a kind of skill-based, use it to develop it kind of system, which is actually kind of a surprisingly modern design for a game of its age. And I think that's kind of where it falls, because of the limitations that it was functioning under with the platform that it was on and the capabilities that it had. There just wasn't an ability to put enough of the enough game in the game to make that kind of progression system actually work. Right, where you have lots of side quests and other things to do that kind of help you improve your characters or rework your characters with, potentially even maybe like redistribution or something, I don't know, to avoid having to just grind endlessly to develop your characters or exploit the system a little bit to work around some of its quirks. And also, they extended it far too wide, because they put things into that system that never should have been. They never should have included the actual spells in that kind of progression system. The spells should have just been static and flat. You shouldn't have had to level up your spells to be able to do basic things or to make them function properly, especially spells you get late in the game, which come in at level, basically useless compared to the spells you've been using since the beginning of the game. So, yeah. I would say nice attempts, but it didn't kind of work out in execution. In contrast with Final Fantasy III, I enjoyed Final Fantasy III's job system. I liked the mechanics of, in certain places of the game, needing to like toad yourself or mini yourself and needing to take advantage of the job system to kind of deal with those situations or to beat certain bosses. I think that was pretty well executed. But what ultimately got me to put 2 ahead of 3 is on characters and story. In my opinion, 2 has a much stronger, main cast of characters. It has a much more coherent story than 3 does. The main party in Final Fantasy 3 were basically nameless, faceless objects. The main party basically had no character. The story was kind of scatterbrained and haphazard. So yeah, ultimately, because I place a little bit more importance on, especially with a story-driven game, on those elements, it kind of bumps 2 above 3 for me. Because 2 is a stronger story than 3, in my opinion. Now, I know that there was a DS remake of 3 that I think probably fixed some of those issues. Actually gave the main party some characters and some personality. But that's not the version I played. I played the Pixel Remaster, which, as far as I know, is as close to the original as you can get without breaking out a Nintendo or a Famicom and finding an original cartridge somewhere. So that's where I am with those 3 games. Alright, so let's move on to number 12. Now, number 12 is going to be probably what I've heard anyway is one of the more divisive. I don't know if divisive is the right term. Controversial? No. I'm not sure. It's a game that's kind of love it or hate it. I don't know about hate. And it's going to be Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII is going to come at number 12. I kind of fall on the side of, you know, it not exactly being my favorite Final Fantasy game. I think it's a perfectly good functional RPG. It has some great elements. The music's awesome. It has an incredibly good mini game in Triple Triad. It's visually a significant upgrade over the previous game in the series, Final Fantasy VII. But ultimately, where I have issues with Final Fantasy VIII are, one, I didn't particularly care for Squall as a main character. It's a little odd, at least from my memory, I didn't... He was a little bit too brooding and angsty. I mean, Cloud is that way, but he wasn't quite as to the level of Squall. A little bit too much, in my opinion. Maybe my opinion will change as I play it again, but that's where I kind of sit at the moment. There are also some issues with the plot and how it all kind of works out. But ultimately, where I run into issues with Final Fantasy VIII is from a mechanical perspective. And I think this is probably one of the more common criticisms, is the junction system and the draw system for how magic works. So in Final Fantasy VIII, they have what are called the Guardian Forces, which are basically the summon creatures from most of the other Final Fantasies. Your Shiva, your Ifrit, your Titan, Garuda, those elements. And you assign them to a character, kind of similar to Final Fantasy VI in that way. And when you do, that unlocks the junction system that allows you to junction magic to your characters to improve certain stats. And the better the spell you junction, the better the bonus you get. Which, perfectly fine. If that were just the case, you know, I wouldn't have too much of an issue. But then comes along the draw system. Okay? So spells in Final Fantasy VIII don't work like a lot of spells. Well, don't work the way spells work in most games. In the Final Fantasy series or most other RPGs. You have no MP or mana or anything like that. Each individual spell has a set number of casts in a pool that you can, you know, use. Almost like an item. And it stacks to 99, I think, if I recall correctly. And in order to acquire stacks of a spell to cast, you have to draw that magic from an enemy or a draw point in the world. And given that an enemy or a draw point only gives kind of low single digits, it can take a long time to build a full stack of 99. But if that were just the case, I probably wouldn't have too much issue with the draw system. It's when these two systems interact with each other that problems start to emerge. Because not only in the junction system is the bonus that you get from the junctioning based on the, you know, the strength of the spell that you're junctioning, it's also based on the size of the stack of that spell that you're junctioning. So you are heavily incentivized to make sure that you build your stack of your spell all the way to 99, which involves spending a significant amount of time drawing spell from enemies and draw points. And you want to go after the best spells in the game, which often have very limited draw availability. And so, once you do junction those spells to your character, you are then strongly disincentivized from actually using that spell. Because if you actually cast a spell from a stack that you have junctioned to somebody, it reduces the bonus that you get, and therefore you end up, you know, impacting the bonuses you're getting to your characters by casting magic. So you're incentivized to, you know, build up your stacks to maximum, and you're disincentivized from then ever actually using those stacks of magic. Or at least the ones that you have junctioned anyway. So it runs into this issue of various like incentives in the game of how the player is being, you know, driven to do certain behaviors in the game. And it's not something that I particularly cared for. And also, by the time you've built your characters up, if you're doing everything properly, like, you get to the point where you're doing 9,000 damage a hit with your basic hits anyway, and even the strongest spell in the game, Ultima, only does like, what, 3,000 to 4,000 damage, or at least in my memory that was the case. So it's like, why would you ever even cast it anyway? Because it's pretty much useless. You just go through all of your fights spamming the basic attack action because that's your strongest ability. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with Final Fantasy VIII. Maybe I'll change my opinion when I play it again. So, we'll see. We'll see. Alright, so let's move on from Final Fantasy VIII. There are some other things I can mention about 8, but they're a little bit too spoilery. So I'll save that for maybe after I've played 8 at the end of that series. So we'll just leave it here for now. Alright, now the next 2 games on the list I'm going to put here are going to be a bit unique in this list, because the reason why I'm putting both of these games where they're at in the list doesn't really have to do with the quality of the games themselves, because these games are almost certainly going to move after I've had a chance to play them again, because the big reason why I can't really rank them any higher than this is because I have little to no memory of them. Because again, it's been 15, 20 years since I've played them, and for whatever reason, they just didn't stick. I do have some memory of them. I know that I played them, and I do have some memory of certain aspects of the game, but I can't really recall much about the games, so I kind of am stuck putting them here. So, at number 11, we're going to be putting Final Fantasy IX. Where's 9? There's 9. I put these in the wrong order. There we go. Okay. Final Fantasy IX. Now, what can I say about Final Fantasy IX? Not too much, unfortunately. I do remember some of the characters. I do remember liking the Zidane main character better than the Squall main character. Final Fantasy IX was also, as I remember, one of the most graphically exceptional games on the original PlayStation. They really pushed the PS1 to its limit with what it could do. That led to some other issues, which we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the story of Final Fantasy IX and much of the other characters, like I remember the Garnet/Dagger character, I remember Vivi character, but in terms of the story, why anything is happening, or really the world itself is kind of really hazy for me. So, unfortunately, yeah, I can't say much else. Except that the one thing that did stick out to me that I do remember about Final Fantasy IX, and as being a bit of an issue for me at the time, was how short the game was. But then again, I didn't have any comparison to previous Final Fantasies, which are probably about the same length, and how easy Final Fantasy IX was. And the reason why Final Fantasy IX, in my opinion, was so incredibly easy is that in order to obtain, this is not anything that I know of definitively, this is just something that I believe, that in order to obtain the kind of capabilities that they did with the game graphically and mechanically on the PlayStation, they had to scrimp every last bit of RAM they could. And so when you look through the bestiary in Final Fantasy IX and the official strategy guide, which I did back when I was much younger and was playing the game, you notice something. Is that there is no enemy in the entire game, at least on the PlayStation version of the game, that had more than 65,535 health. Which, if you're familiar with computers or, binary number systems, you'll recognize that as the maximum integer value of an 8-bit integer. You'll say, well, the PlayStation was a 32-bit system. Why do you only have 8-bit ints? Probably because they were scraping every last 10-bit of RAM they could. Now, that isn't necessarily a problem, because, we've had 8-bit games before. But what you have to do is you have to scale everything else around that limitation. If you look at previous Final Fantasies on the PlayStation, like Final Fantasy 7 and 8, you'll have enemies with hundreds of thousands of HP, with a party that can, do only around 10,000 damage at max. But when you only have 60,000 HP for the final boss of the entire game, you have a 4-man party, and each one of them can do 10,000 damage a turn. Those fights don't last long. The bosses barely even have time to do any of their mechanics, and you blow through the game relatively fast. Like, only one boss in the entire game ever presented any challenge. That was Ozma, to my memory, which was one of the optional super bosses. And that's because it did some crazy stuff, from my memory, that, very drastically limited the capabilities of your party. So, yeah. That was the biggest problem that I had with Final Fantasy IX. So, we'll see. We'll see how it goes when we get there. Once I've actually played through and have better memory of the characters and story, it might move. It might move up. I doubt that it will move down, because it can't really move much further down other than one spot, because I'm not pushing it any lower than the 8-bit Final Fantasies. So, almost certainly it's going to move up. Once I've had a chance to play it again. And so, in a similar vein, at number 10, we're going to be bringing in Final Fantasy 12. Because, like 9, I have a very similar issue with 12, and that I have very limited memories of the characters or the story. I remember it being a very pretty game. I remember the soundtrack being awesome. I do remember some characters. Fran. And, but beyond that, it's kind of a fog for me. Now, there are aspects of Final Fantasy XII that I do actually remember, that I do know that I liked a lot. I like the combat system in Final Fantasy XII. I like the gambit system for setting up all of your party members' actions. It's actually very similar to Dragon Age Origins in some ways. Another, similar system that I also rather enjoyed. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to playing Final Fantasy XII again, simply because I do have those gaps in my memory that, I remember really liking the game, but I can't remember why so much. So that should be nice. This one's probably going to move up when we come back here as well. So we'll see how that goes. And again, unfortunately, can't really say much more than that about Final Fantasy XII. So let's move on to number 9 on the list. Now, at number 9, I'm going to be putting Final Fantasy 13. We're kind of hitting the middle area of the list, and I consider Final Fantasy 13 to be kind of middle of the road as far as Final Fantasy games go. Final Fantasy 13 received a lot of criticism when it first came out about the linear hallway design of the various areas of the game. the combat system, the story, all kinds of stuff. Couple of things. One, I didn't care at all about the linear design of the game's environments. That didn't matter to me at all. So that had no impact whatsoever on what my opinion of the game was. And as far as the combat system in Final Fantasy XIII, I actually liked the combat system in Final Fantasy XIII. I thought it was a bit more strategic than your standard turn-based combat. Because you kind of had to, like, queue things up. Right? I had no issues whatsoever with Final Fantasy XIII's combat system. Not a one. Where I did bump into some problems with Final Fantasy XIII was the way that its story was presented, especially at the beginning of the game. Now, my memory is a bit foggy on this, but I do remember something about there was supposed to be, well, there eventually was, like multiple games in the Final Fantasy XIII franchise. I mean, they did eventually release Final Fantasy XIII 2 and Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns, but I think there was even supposed to be like a prequel game that was supposed to come out. Was it Final Fantasy Versus 13? That was supposed to be part of that whole franchise as well, and I think that we were supposed to get a lot more information about the world and how and all do all the world building in that game, and that game never saw the light of day. It entered development hell and disappeared to the ether. So the Final Fantasy XIII basically throws the player straight into the thick of things. What did I say? Whatever. Straight into the thick of things, and gives you almost no explanation as to what anything is that's happening or what anything is that anyone's talking about. And so, like, my first 2 hours of playing Final Fantasy XIII were just lost in confusion. What I had to do is, once I could get control of the game, I had to go into the game's glossary and basically read through all the terminology and everything about the game's, you know, world building through the glossary system. And once I did, I started everything back over, and then afterwards, everything made a lot more sense, and I was able to continue playing with too much issue. But yeah, largely, I'm pretty happy with Final Fantasy XIII. That's only the real major complaint that I have is that kind of early game onboarding process for new players is not good at all. But, you know, if you can kind of get yourself around it, then, in my opinion, the game is pretty good. No real issues with Final Fantasy XIII. But, again, what we would say, middle of the road, as far as the games go. Alright, so, rank 8. For rank 8, I'm going to be putting in Final Fantasy XVI. Another middle-of-the-road Final Fantasy game, in my opinion. Again, as far as the combat system, I think which gets a lot of kind of criticism. I like the combat system in Final Fantasy XIV. Not Final Fantasy XIV. I do like the combat system in Final Fantasy XIV, but we're not talking about Final Fantasy XIV. We're talking about Final Fantasy XVI. Also, the characters. I had no issues with many of the characters. I liked the story was fine. Got a little weird here and there, but I mean, you could say that about most Final Fantasy games. The story gets a little weird in places. So no real issues there. I liked the kind of swapping in and out of the magic that you had access to, all that sort of stuff to kind of build your character how you like to play. The absolute epic cinematic boss fights were incredible. The music was awesome in Final Fantasy XVI. The big issue with Final Fantasy XVI is that it definitely felt like an action game with RPG elements rather than an RPG game with action elements. If you know what I mean by that. I don't know if I could even really give very many details about why I think that. That's just the kind of sense that I came out of finishing the game with. Was, you know, that felt more like playing an action game that had some RPG stuff in it than playing a proper RPG with some action stuff to it. You know, now that's not a bad thing. I mean, you can have a perfectly good game that is that kind of style, but I don't know how well it kind of slots into the Final Fantasy pantheon in that kind of style. So that's only my real issue. It's my only real issue there with Final Fantasy 16. But largely, I consider it to be a solid game. I enjoyed playing it. But yeah, that's where I'm at there. Now this one is not one that I'm going to be playing again as part of this project, because I've already played it. I already have it recorded, and it's already up on my other channel that I'm not working with anymore. Long story. All right, but moving on from Final Fantasy 16, not much more to say there. So at number 7, I'm going to be putting Final Fantasy IV. The first of the 16-bit era Final Fantasies, which represented a significant improvement over the 8-bit era Final Fantasies. Final Fantasy IV had a very solid story. Definitely had a much larger scale from the previous Final Fantasies, and is absolutely on par with, you know, again, some of the other major games in the series. It's, you know, a game that I'd actually like to see remade if I didn't not trust Square Enix to properly remake a game. That's a bunch of negatives there, but I think you know what I mean. The job system in 4 was good. Characters were great. Story was solid. It did have a little bit of the, what I would call, sudden final boss syndrome. Which I don't know what the proper terminology for this in a narrative structure sense, but what I call sudden final boss syndrome is when getting close to the end of a story, you suddenly introduce the idea that the antagonist that you've been chasing the entire time, this is going to be a bit spoilery, the antagonist that you've been chasing the entire time is not the true antagonist, that there's another new antagonist that is the real antagonist that you need to fight. And then that comes in. Final Fantasy IV kind of does this to some extent. It's by far not the worst. Actually, the worst of that, and I didn't really mention it, was in Final Fantasy IX. That's another thing about Final Fantasy IX that I do remember, is the fact that the final boss that you fight in Final Fantasy IX literally comes out of nowhere at the end of the game. We'll talk about that, I guess, when we get to Final Fantasy IX. But for Final Fantasy IV, they do this a little bit. Now, that can work in a story sense, but usually you have to make sure that the new antagonist is something that's been foreshadowed or already exists in the plot or in the story as a character that the audience is already familiar with, to the sudden reveal that that's not what I want. To suddenly reveal that, you know, this person that we thought was not an issue is actually an issue. That's when it kind of works. When you bring a new antagonist in from completely left field with no time to develop them or do anything to get the audience invested in them, is when it kind of runs into problem. And that's what we have in 4 a little bit, from what I remember. And yeah, but otherwise, I really enjoyed 4. It was a great fun time. yeah, pretty solid. All right, and so for number 6, for number 5 and 6, we're going to be dealing with 5 and 6 at the same time as well, is we're going to be putting the other two 16-bit era games, Final Fantasies 5 and 6. Now, I debated with these as well which one's going to go where, because I think that Final Fantasies 5 and 6 are basically on par with each other. They have strength in certain areas, weaknesses in others, and they're very hard, in my opinion, to kind of rank here. But what I ultimately settled on is that, funnily enough, Final Fantasy 6 is going to be at 6, and Final Fantasy 5 is going to be at 5. I really, really enjoyed Final Fantasy 5. And I also really, really enjoyed Final Fantasy 6. And the thing is that what pushed 5 above 6 for me, I think, comes down to personal taste. I just liked the job system of Final Fantasy 5 a little bit better than the Magicite system from Final Fantasy 6. I also personally preferred the story and characters in Final Fantasy V over 6, because 5 has a bit more of a lighthearted story and characters. It has a little bit more humor and levity in it to kind of counterbalance some of its pathos, to pull a quote from another Final Fantasy character. Whereas Final Fantasy VI is kind of pretty serious throughout, and the only real kind of silliness comes in with its villain, and Kefka. So, you know, to my personal taste, I like having that little bit of extra levity in a story. So that's kind of what pushes Final Fantasy V above 6 to me. They're both incredibly good games. I would recommend them to anybody who's a fan of Final Fantasy or just a fan of RPGs. They're definitely up there with some of the best stuff that Squaresoft at the time made. So, yeah. Not too much to complain about with Final Fantasy 4 and 5. I don't really have any issues with either of those games, because we're kind of entering now the upper tiers where I don't have anything negative to say about any of these games. So that's where I kind of put Final Fantasy 4 and 5. Not 4 and 5, 6 and 5. Again, I would say all 3 of those 16-bit Final Fantasy games would be great games to see remade in a modern format, because I think they would be awesome. But I, again, don't trust Square Enix right now to remake anything in a way that would be satisfactory to anyone who's a fan of those games. I mean, they would probably be good games, it just wouldn't be what the fans of those games would actually want. So, you know, there's that. Alright, so moving on to number 4. At number 4, we're going to be putting Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is a great game. It's the first game on the PlayStation 2. It's the first Final Fantasy that was fully voice acted. It has a great story, great world, great characters, great voice work as well. Yes, even that scene. I could go off on a rant about it, but I'm not. You know, if you know, you know. And Final Fantasy X also has one of the best mini games in all of Final Fantasy, Blitzball. When we play Final Fantasy X, I will be playing a lot of Blitzball. And on a complete side note, Yoshi P, bring Blitzball to 14. That's all I gotta say. Find a way to do it. All right. Again, nothing I can really say negative about Final Fantasy X. Just trying to think if there's anything else. I just think, again, it's a really, really very good game. It's on par with 5 and 6, I would say. Again, these games 4, 5, 6, and 10 are all kind of very evenly matched, in my opinion. Rock solid, great RPGs, great story, great characters, great music, well fleshed out world. Yeah, it's one of the ones I'm really looking forward to playing again when we get around to it. All right. Other than singing its praises, I don't think I have anything more to say about Final Fantasy X. And so we're moving on to the top 3, which there's only 3 left. And there's 2 of them that are rather conspicuous that I haven't put in the list yet. And we're beginning to one of them. So coming in at number 3 is going to be Final Fantasy XI. I absolutely adore Final Fantasy XI. It's not the first MMO. It's the first Final Fantasy MMO that was released. It's not the first MMO I played, because I played a few ones before Final Fantasy XI came out. But I still think, personally, that Final Fantasy XI is one of the best MMOs available in the market right now. The story and characters in the various expansions are great. There's some clunkers in there, largely at the beginning of the game, which, you know, kind of sounds similar to the other Final Fantasy MMO. But for the vast majority of everything that, you know, in terms of the story content in the game is great. The Chains of Ramathia expansion's great. The Treasures of Urgen expansion storyline and characters are great. The Wings of the Goddess storyline and characters are great. The Seekers of Adoulin story and characters are great. The Rhapsodies of Vana'diel storyline is great. Again, it's definitely not only one of my favorite MMOs I've ever played, one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, one of my favorite works of fiction I've ever experienced. And anyone who's a Final Fantasy fan who hasn't played Final Fantasy XI, I think does themselves a favor to do so. And if you're a fan of MMOs, I would say you should also do so. The game has incredibly deep, very rich, very sophisticated mechanics in terms, and also, like, if you're into really, really deep, complex, horizontal gear systems in MMOs, play Final Fantasy XI. It has a really deep, complex, horizontal gear system. So, yeah, it's just rock solid all around. But, that said, Final Fantasy XI is also one of the most frustrating games for me as well. Not because of the game itself, but because of Square Enix. And the way Square Enix has treated Final Fantasy XI through almost its entire life. It failed to promote it properly when it first released it. And, you know, while it did release a string of really good expansions that, as the game has aged, it has basically cut back its team. It has tried to kill the game on a couple of occasions. Final Fantasy XI is one of the most profitable games that Square Enix has ever made. In fact, I think up until Final Fantasy XIV, the Shadowbringers expansion, Final Fantasy XI was still the most profitable game they ever released. And they've tried to kill it on multiple occasions, as I said. Usually, when you have an incredibly profitable product in your lineup, you know, build on it. You support it. You invest in it. And no, Square wants to get rid of it and replace it with something else. I mean, it's a game that all it needs is a little bit of modernizing and polishing in its UI, graphics, and a few other systems, and it would be as good as any other MMO on the market. I even think it's better than WoW. And I played both games. So, yeah. I am a full-throated, walking, talking advertisement for Final Fantasy XI. So, in my top 3. So, we have 2 more to talk about. Now, the game that's going to be coming in at number 2 for a very long time was number 1. And of course, obviously, there's only 2 left, so let's just go ahead and lay them out. What games where? So coming in at number 2 is going to be Final Fantasy VII. And at number 1 is Final Fantasy XIV. Now, as I said, that for the longest time, Final Fantasy VII would have been number 1 on this list. And in fact, for a very long time, Final Fantasy XIV probably would be down here. But Final Fantasy XVI, maybe just a little bit above Final Fantasy XVI. It'd be definitely down around 8 or 9. Right? Is where I would have put Final Fantasy XIV. Until the Shadowbringers expansion came out. And the Shadowbringers expansion of Final Fantasy XIV changed everything. It elevated the game all the way up to the number 1 spot. It is one of the most miraculous pieces of narrative fiction I have ever experienced. Because not only was it incredibly good at itself, it made the entire rest of the previous game better. And without the Shadowbringers expansion being as good as it was, the subsequent Endwalker expansion would not have been anywhere near as good as it was. So the Shadowbringers and Endwalkers expansion, as a set, basically brings Final Fantasy XIV all the way up to the number 1 spot as not only my favorite Final Fantasy game, favorite MMO, one of my favorite works of fiction, which, you know, all 3 of these at the top are. Like, it's, you know, and I don't think anything is going to be able to supplant it. Not even itself. I don't know if they'll be able to do anything that will go anywhere close to what they achieved with Shadowbringers and Endwalker. And yes, I know, the Dawn Trail expansion hasn't exactly been the best. But that the fact that the Dawn Trail expansion hasn't been the best does not negate how good the Shadowbringers and Endwalker expansions were. So they'll always be there, and Final Fantasy XIV will always sit at the top of this list on the strength of those 2 expansions. You'd almost have to release a perfect game to supplant 14 for me right now. To really push anything into the top 3, it'll have to be almost perfect. Now, I know Final Fantasy VII's not perfect. In fact, we haven't talked about Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII, again, was my first Final Fantasy. It's still, in my opinion, an incredibly good game. Well realized. The only thing I could kind of criticize it on is for its graphics. The kind of like chibi character designs. Like, but, you know, Square Enix, well, it wasn't Square Enix at the time, it was Square Soft, I think. Was still figuring out how the whole new, you know, 3D RPG was gonna work, and, you know, kind of be forgiven a little bit for a little bit of a goofiness and with that. But yeah, like, I think Final Fantasy has been chasing Final Fantasy 5, 6, and 7 since they came out, and I don't think that they've come anywhere close to those games. Final Fantasy VII also has probably my favorite magic system in the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise, with the materia system. Yeah, and so many just great, fun little aspects to that game. So yeah, but as I said, it would have been my number 1 for a very long time. I also tend to find with people that very often I think that their first Final Fantasy is their favorite Final Fantasy, and the kind of the same is true here. At least was for a while, anyway. But yeah, Final Fantasy VII is as good as any game in the franchise. I think it definitely has one of the strongest main antagonists in any of the games. Yes, Sephiroth is a better antagonist, in my opinion, than Kefka. And just thinking back on it, like, there is probably no more satisfying moment that I've ever experienced in gaming is at the end of Final Fantasy VII. And I don't know if I need to say, spoiler alert, that the end of Final Fantasy XI results in a duel, a one-on-one confrontation between Sephiroth and Cloud. After you've beaten all of Sephiroth's, like, god forms, it just becomes a one-on-one fight, and absolutely smashing Sephiroth in the face with Omnislash at that point in the game was incredibly satisfying. So, again, another thing I'm looking forward to when we play Final Fantasy VII here soon. Alright, so that covers all 16 of the mainline numbered Final Fantasy games. As I said, we're going to play through the rest of the games. We're going to cycle back here, and I'm going to see if any of these opinions have changed, and if any of these positions change as well. So, look forward to Final Fantasy VII being the next series that we're going to be doing, and one of the things that I'm considering doing for for almost the rest of the entire series, because I can, is to play Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 13 using the original physical discs that I still do possess. In fact, I tracked them all down. I have a stack of my original Final Fantasy discs sitting on a shelf. And on the original hardware, because I have a functioning PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PlayStation 3, and I have a capture card in my computer, so I should be able to capture video from all three of those systems. So I think that might be interesting to play through all of these games in their original formats, rather than through the PC ports. So yeah, that's what I'm considering doing. Alright, well, we will get to that at some point. At the moment, my schedule is kind of full, but I do have Final Fantasy VII in the pipe. As soon as I have an available time slot to slot it in, we will be getting to that. Alright, and I hope you guys will enjoy it. So, I will see you then. Next time.